Hello, my name is Abbey Ward, and today I'll be presenting on my honors thesis titled Language Proficiency and Lexical-Semantic Processing in Bilingual Toddlers. So my presentation highlights recent research being conducted in the field of psycholinguistics that suggests lexical-semantic networks, or in other words, vocabulary systems, interact with one another in bilingual individuals. Our first research question was aimed at answering whether these vocabulary systems interact across languages in bilingual children as young as 2 years of age. So is it that the words perro and cat and their concepts overlap, or are these two words relatively separated into two different vocabulary systems? This is demonstrated in Figure 1. Secondly, we wanted to know that if these vocabulary systems interact, then what are the sources of variability that predict this organization? Our second research question looked at whether proficiency, the words that a child says and understands, versus exposure, the words that a child hears in each language, influences hypothesized cross-language interaction, shown here in Figure 2. Now moving to our methods. A group of 20 toddlers, approximately 2.5 years of age, with dual language exposure to Spanish and English participated in the study. As a group, they were exposed to Spanish more than English. We included children with evidence of early language delay in order to assess language proficiency across a continuum. We used 4 measures to answer our research questions. To answer our first question on cross-language interaction, we used an eye tracking system to measure the toddler's processing of semantically related and unrelated words in 4 different language conditions within and across English and Spanish. For example, as shown in Figure 3, a toddler was presented with the prime word jacket and then heard the related target coat. They were then presented with a pair of distractor and target images. During the image presentation was when we assessed their looking behavior and calculated the prime effect for the proportion of total looks in related trials minus unrelated trials. Now moving to our independent variables of interest, we used the Language Exposure Assessment tool, a parent report measure, to capture toddlers' exposure in both Spanish and English. The English-Spanish Vocabulary Inventories is also a parent report of expressive vocabulary size of the words that a child says. Then we have the Computerized Comprehension Task, in which children were prompted to touch a target image, as seen here in Figure 4. This was a measure of children's receptive vocabulary, or the words they understand, and then their speed of word recognition. So what do we find? Remember, our first question was interested in knowing whether vocabulary systems interact across languages. In Figure 5, we have children's proportion of total looks to the target object on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we have 4 different language conditions, which looked at within and across language processing. The dark gray bars are related trials, and the light gray are unrelated trials. The line at 50% indicates that children looked to the target above chance. Our results indicate that when the prime word was in Spanish, children had a greater proportion of looks in the related trials than the unrelated trials. When the prime word was in English, we see the reverse effect, where children had a greater proportion of looks in the unrelated trials than the related trials, and this was significantly different in the within English block. Now moving to our second research question about proficiency and exposure. Here we have our Spanish primary results in Table 1, so when the prime word was in Spanish. I have listed the correlations between the prime effect and our measures of proficiency and exposure. The significant effects are bolded. So what do we see? We first note that language exposure was not correlated with the prime effect in both Spanish language conditions. Now with proficiency, we found that this was the better predictor of lexical-semantic processing. Overall, you see that children with large receptive vocabularies and slow reaction times had the largest prime effects in Spanish. Table 2 shows correlations between the prime effect and measures of proficiency and exposure, but this time when English was the prime word. Again, we see that relative language exposure was not correlated with the prime effect. In English, we see that faster reaction times correlated with larger priming effects only in the within English condition. So what can we interpret from these findings? We see from our results that there is evidence for cross-language interactions in young bilingual children as early as 2 years of age, but these numerical differences are not significant. But what explains the different patterns of findings in English versus Spanish? Our results suggest that young bilingual children are sensitive to semantic relatedness in their stronger language, or Spanish. In English, their weaker language, children use their sparse vocabularies in such a way that knowing fewer words is leveraged to support correct target identification. We answered our second research question by finding that proficiency rather than exposure was the better predictor of lexical-semantic processing both within and across language conditions. As a group, toddlers with larger vocabulary sizes and faster speed of word recognition in their stronger language, Spanish, demonstrated inhibition, such that they were more likely to efficiently discard words similar in meaning in order to correctly identify the target. This is represented by Figure 8. where multiple competing links in a network result in inhibition. When processing relatedness between words in their weaker language or English, toddlers with slower speed of word recognition demonstrated facilitation, which may offset the fact that they have a sparse vocabulary, as demonstrated here in Figure 9. Figure 10 represents our findings that language exposure was not associated with lexical-semantic processing. Rather, we conclude that proficiency measured by vocabulary size and speed of word recognition was a stronger predictor of lexical-semantic processing. Lastly, I would like to extend my thanks to the families who participated in this study, my colleagues in the Early to Language Development Lab, especially my mentor Dr. Stephanie Deanna, and the OVPRI Fellowship, which funded me during the summer of 2019. Thank you!